produce the blue food for Indonesia, those millions of Indonesians. And we want to explore the ways of increasing impact in the communities by developing the means to connect them locally to the National Food Program so that they get better prices, have better infrastructure, live better lives, and have a greater incentive to preserve their environment. Because destructive fishing practices usually happen when the means to connect them locally to the and fishers are not able to make a sufficient living from their coastal communities, and so they resort to things that ultimately will harm them in the long run. But this must be holistic because those communities depend upon the integrity of the mangrove forests where the fish breed in early stages of their life cycle. These communities depend upon the integrity of the coral reefs that are so beautiful in Indonesia and so many parts of this amazing country, but are also under threat in many places, both from global warming, but also from other sources of environmental degradation. What we look for is the opportunity to work with all of you to bring together what Stanford has to offer with what Indonesia has to offer in science, in technology, in policy development, in an understanding of your nation and your communities in a way that we as outsiders will never achieve. And so the ultimate goal of the center we're working to create will be to be a hub for the Stanford campus to provide a focal point where we can bring together all of the resources in all of those different schools that you saw in the dean's lecture, the business school, the medical school, and so on and so forth, and all of the expertise there with partners in genuine partnerships here in Indonesia. And that's what I hope that we can achieve over the next few years with the help of Pakita and others.
Thank you so much, David. Big hand. We're gonna allow questions from the audience a little bit later, but I'll start off with Yi, who has done a lot of work on batteries. There's a lot of us within this room and beyond this room that are sort of vested in the pre-existing nickel industry. The electrification of vehicles around the world has been on the back of nickel. Indonesia is one of the largest producers of nickel, which is largely used in electrification for vehicles and other means. There's also this lingering concern about the next evolution in terms of what materials will be used for electrification purposes, be that sodium or lithium. I was curious if you may be able to shed some light on how you see this sustenance of the usage of nickel going forward, alluding to what the coordinating minister, Pak Agus Yudhoyono, alluded to earlier. Nickel is a tool for many to be uplifted. It's about the uplifting of the many, not the few. The sustenance of nickel as part of this electrification going forward, I think, is within the minds of many, not only in this room, but beyond this room in Indonesia. Please.
Yeah, maybe I'll just share some thoughts first. Will also knows a lot about nickel. First of all, nickel is so useful for many things. Nickel, the biggest use still used in stainless steel. You need to use nickel. This reason behind this, stainless steel got to use nickel. So above that, the past decades, roughly, the expansion of electrical cars, the cathode using so-called NMC, nickel manganese cobalt oxide, now use in higher and higher nickel content to reduce cobalt content to reduce the cost. So this use a lot of nickel. However, now with an MMC, with a nickel cathode, there's a competition of lithium iron phosphate, iron base, that start to eat up the some of the nickel cathodes market share. This is for lithium ion batteries. However, there's a new opportunity coming in for nickel to be applied. One area will be, we discuss about sodium ion batteries. The sodium ion batteries cathode could utilize nickel, opening up new opportunities for nickel. But whether sodium is the solution to compete with lithium, that remains to be seen economically, performance-wise. The second application open up could use a lot of nickel. It's something I work on. I invented about 7-8 years ago, called nickel hydrogen gas batteries. This is aqueous solution phase base using nickel hydroxide as the cathode. This is for stationary energy storage connected with electrical grid. It's a much safer battery, very long lifetime. This could potentially open up a really big market for nickel. So this is from application standpoint to analyze nickel. Then I think Indonesia is blessed with so much nickel mine right here. And from the mining opportunity, it's the development of processing, this opportunity right there. Can you mine nickel to extract the higher percentage of nickel, extract from the sources, even with a lower concentration of nickel, you can still extract economically. And also, can you develop a process that can extract nickel that has low environmental footprint? Don't use so much chemicals. You don't consume that much amount of water. I think this opportunity right here. At Stanford University, we really pay attention to the new type of processing, how to extract minerals. This opportunity to collaborate right here between Stanford and Indonesia. This also, what I mentioned is the new application of nickel, where this could go, this opportunity as well. But let me share with you a final thought. This is more scientific right now. So nickel is a very, very special metal. I'll tell you why it's so special. An aqueous solution under the high pH base condition, this very few metal that can be stable in water, an aqueous solution. Nickel is one of them, one of the very, very few. That's why nickel is so useful. So I would say the future of nickel got to be bright, given there's so many applications possible and its unique chemical property. I'll pause right here.
Thank you so much. Not only do you sound like the best soccer player amongst the scientists, but you sound like a real scientist amongst the scientists.
Sarasoft, sabun berserum yang menghidrasi rambut lebih maksimal. Try and just feel it.
Maybe you have something to add.
I'll follow up with Will. If you want to add to whatever you were saying, but I want to ask a broader question. Indonesia's electrification is about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. Singapore and Brunei are at about 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. India is about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. For large developing economies to become modern, such as India and Indonesia, from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000, which is, I think, the threshold for modernity, at the rate that India builds about 19,000 megawatts per year, Indonesia builds about 3,000 megawatts per year, it's going to take more than 100 years for both India and Indonesia, or each of the two. Silicon Valley is the perfect intersection between entrepreneurship and academia. How do you fuse the two together so that there's this necessary technological innovation? But for developing economic purposes, it needs to be affordable. That needle is only going to move up faster than 100 years if the technological innovation can be procured at a much more economically sound manner for people in the global south, in the developing economies or those in Indonesia? Please.
Akita, thank you very much. Let me first comment a bit more on nickel, and appreciate E for the chemistry lesson, very important. I'd like to comment on it at the strategic level. What is the solution we want at the end in terms of battery technologies, whether it's for mobility or for the grid? We want security, and that requires diversification. There's been many points in history where we saw so-called technology lock-in, in which there's only one technology for a given solution. Silicon solar cell is one such example. Let me state a provocative opinion of my own, which is I think we should innovate such that we don't have technology lock-in in order to have technology diversification. We are fortunate there are multiple types of battery chemistries. Some use nickel, some use iron, and others. Some use lithium, some use sodium. I think it makes a lot of sense to invest our resources to innovate different types of solutions that could make sense. For mobility, we're looking at 15 to 20 million vehicles per year. We're only scratching the surface. So the great news is that the pie is growing. Even though there is some risk and uncertainty in the composition of nickel for this entire transition, no doubt that nickel will continue to grow in its use for the energy transition. But I'd like to also encourage the innovators here in Indonesia to contribute to the global effort to diversify technologies. Because if we have several, not one, several battery technologies that use different minerals that's suited for different use cases, different regions, then we can have enhanced security of supply chain. So I'd like to just share that thought at a strategic level to where we should drive towards. Gita, to your second question about electricity opportunity, I like to view it in the same way, which is, wow, what a tremendous opportunity and time where the use and demand of electricity is rising sharply in regions like Indonesia. This is a huge blessing in my mind. Now, at the same time, it's also a challenge because we must carefully balance between sustainability, affordability, and security when it comes to deploying additional electricity capacity. I think what we can really work together on is innovate for affordability. Now, technologies usually have to be more expensive before they're less expensive. This is the very natural learning curve in cost coming down. I think there is a great deal of opportunity for innovating how to get down this cost curve faster. Financially, we can also think about how to finance the learning curve. But one thing is clear when it comes to electricity, it must be competitive as not to stunt economic growth in the region. So I think there is a huge opportunity space to meet the rapidly growing demand in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, in Global South, and elsewhere in the world. But innovation has to be part of it, especially innovating for economics.
Thank you, Will.
One day or day one. One day or
Please. David, I'd like to start off with a contrast between China and Indonesia. China's economic success, paradoxically, has been on the basis or on the back of decentralization of economic activities on top of a very much centralized political system. Whereas Indonesia and other large democracies have been able to decentralize politics but I think the economic activities are much more centralized. So it's tempting with an intuition to think that perhaps to create a more competitive landscape, economically speaking, we need to be mindful of further decentralizing economic activities in countries like Indonesia and other large democratic countries. Now, in the context of blue food, right? How do you envision the splitting between the role of local government and local entrepreneurs for purposes of moving the needle up in terms of nutrition, protein, and all the necessary ingredients that would be able to mitigate the risks of stunting and malnutrition and all the other kinds of deficiencies, particularly for those within the coastal communities?
So you're asking me to provide the solutions that our next 3 years of research are supposed to produce. Thank you. I think what you've outlined, Paquita, are the challenges that we face in thinking about how among the overlapping and often competing ministerial landscape, where multiple ministries have portfolios that involve coastal communities and forests and fisheries and so forth, where we have laws that require a balancing between the priority of economic growth and the laws and regulatory frameworks that protect mangroves, that protect forests, that protect the ocean, that protect indigenous peoples and so forth. And so it's not just a matter, and that's where I think your question is so important, although I don't have a clear answer for it. Your question is so important because those problems will not just be solved at the national level. One of the things that we are trying to understand more is the way that policies at the national level are translated into decisions at the provincial level, at the regency level, and at the community level. And that's why often some of us who are focused on sustainability of the coastal communities and their environment find ourselves wondering, how is it that a license was granted in this protected marine reserve to do things which are inherently damaging to that marine reserve or to a forest or whatever? And of course, the national level is crucial because that's where the highest level decisions are made about that balance of economic growth and sustainability. But as we saw in the presentation by Coordinating Minister Yudhoyono, local communities, local governments must have a voice in that process. And in principle, the law allows them to have a voice. But too often those voices are not really heard. And so I think, again, in a nation as large, 280 million people, and as diverse as this one, the challenge of integrating those different interests at the national, at the provincial, at the community level is the key to what we're trying to do. In terms of what you were beginning with about China and Indonesia and decentralization and so forth, everything I know about that, I've learned from you, from your books, from the classes we have taught together and so forth. So I think you're vastly better equipped to answer that part of the question than I am. Thank you.
All right. Let me move back to Will, just to follow up on electrification. We have all the necessary technological wherewithal, whether it is coal, geothermal, wind, hydro, nuclear, wind, whatever. Most of these renewables outside coal can only be procured at about 15 cents per kilowatt. Many of us, most of us in the global south, including Indonesia, of course, can only afford 5 cents. This 5 cents will go up to 6 or 7. But I'm also hopeful that this 15 cents will come down. I mean, to what extent do you think Stanford or academic institutions can play a role in making sure that this 15 cents will come down faster than this 5 cents going up?
Pagita, this is the trillion-dollar question. Let me zoom out for a moment and talk about the solution at the end. As E mentioned, 24/7 clean electricity. That is affordable. Now, there are 4 principal pathways to get there. The first is wind plus solar plus energy storage, not necessarily batteries. The second would be fossil-based, coal-based plus carbon capture. The third would be nuclear. And the fourth and final is geothermal. I was so impressed to see the extent of geothermal deployment on the flight here from Jakarta. You're absolutely correct that all of those 4 options are not cost competitive today, including renewables. So that is the homework assignment. So I put my professor hat on. That is the problem we have to solve. Going back to my earlier comment in terms of innovating for affordability, that could be an engineering problem, but it could also be a non-engineering problem. One of the key opportunity we see is the need for coordination along the value chain. For example, if you look at the deployment of batteries for the grid, there are about 20 different entities involved in the value chain, from the mining companies to the battery makers, to the developers, to the utilities, to the transmission, and to end-use customers. There's a lot of opportunity for enhancing the handshake and efficiency between those commercial government entities. I think that is a low-hanging fruit to coordinate the value chain better, to make sure that everyone is working toward the same solution at the end. Now, there's no silver bullet. It will take time. These learning curves are tough. I think another important aspect, especially for our policymakers, is to take a strategic view of all of these various solution pathways and make the necessary short, mid, and long-term deployment. Absolutely, there are solutions we can deploy today that can drive down the learning curve. In the midterm, we can also deploy first of a kind. I was so delighted to see many of those first of a kind here in Indonesia for geothermal. That is helping. And in the long term, we have to innovate. And I think if you can attack those short, mid, and long-term scale all at the same time, then we have a fighting chance to deliver this 24/7 cooling electricity.
Thank you, Will. Yi, ever since the first industrial revolution, we've emitted about 16 to 1700 gigatons of carbon. On an annual basis, we emit about 40 to 50 gigatons. We've talked about listen to the wisdom on renewabilities, right? I'm curious as to what your views are with respect to sequestering, capturing carbon. Is there any technological wherewithal that can be applied to countries like Indonesia that will be within affordability in the near term, as opposed to having to wait until the long term?
Yeah, the carbon capture sequestration is very important, given the emission rate we are not seeing is coming down. How many gigaton per year of greenhouse gas equivalent, CO2 equivalent. So we need carbon negative technology, carbon neutral, carbon negative. So while speaking, Will is talking about reduction of emission, but we do at the same time need to think about how to get CO2 and other greenhouse gas off the air. So one area, let me highlight, I'm coming to Indonesia is because of the forest, the jungle, the significant biomass you are having right here. If you look at globally, Arun and I talk a lot about this, is practically there might be about 10, in the order of 10 billion ton of carbon already sequestered by plants. This crop waste, this is the practically about 10 billion ton we can utilize to convert this biomass into carbon, solid carbon, that's biochar. But the problem has been this conversion process. For example, based on pyrolysis, the cost is too high. We are talking about $150, $200 per ton of conversion. Not only that, it's not safe. This basically you need to heat out the biomass in the air-free environment to 500, 600 or higher temperature degrees Celsius to carbonize this to become biochar. If this air leak into your conversion factory, this would cause the explosion problem. So what we want to innovate right here at Stanford is we've been developing a 10 times lower cost technique and yet very safe to convert biomass into biochar. So we see great potential of a technology as one example along this direction. Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, can play a very important role. We also see between Stanford, and Indonesia, if a technology developed to maturity can be implemented right here instantaneously. You look at the next several years, these can convert large quantity of biomass into biochar, whether the business model is carbon credit-based model or is replacing existing coal, replacing existing carbon source using this net zero biochar could be very, very exciting. As one example to share with the audience right here. And I agree with also Will coming over to taking the fly, right? So this is not related to carbon. Just look at the volcano right there. I was talking to Arun. I say, well, holy smoke, there's a lot of smoke coming out. That volcano. It looks like there's a lot of geothermal possibility you could utilize. So putting the system thinking Will mentioned, it's Southeast Asia is very special. So doing system level thinking of biomass, geothermal, and your coastal line, and we need to put some thought right there. How do we help renewable at the same time help carbon capture and sequestration?
Thank you, Yi. David, if I may, I'd like to come back to you. We live in a world where governments are going through budget cuts, right? Including that in the US and including some other countries, right? We have just launched an undertaking of nobility here called the Free Lunch Program, right? That within Intuition has and will continue to help the protein intake for the citizenry, right? Now, at the rate that we may have budgetary limitations, call it at the local levels, not at the federal or central levels. What would be your advice with respect to the communities or the community multipliers on the coastal sites so that they can play a more proactive role in moving that needle up for more and better protein intake?
Thank you for, again, a very difficult question, Gita. I feel like I'm the student here. I'm supposed to be the professor. What's going on? So let's talk for a moment about the challenges that those communities face. As I said before, Indonesia is the second largest seaweed producer in the world. China is the largest. Where does Indonesian seaweed go? It goes to China for processing. It's processed not into nutritional products on the whole, but into carrageenan, which is used in a wide variety of uses in cosmetics and all sorts of other areas. What that means is that the seaweed producers, who are all small-scale producers in local communities, are getting an extremely low price for their product because it will go through a very extended supply chain before it winds up leaving the country and being processed elsewhere. The fishers face similar problems because there has not been investment in cold chain infrastructure, which means that fishers in small-scale fisheries, which are by far the dominant mode of fishing in Indonesia, have to sell their fish on the dock to a broker because otherwise it will spoil. Again, they get an extremely low price, and it goes into an extended supply chain and often leaves the country as well for processing. So, of course, one way to address that is to say, well, let's invest in that infrastructure. That would be great. How do you do that in the scenario you described where budgets are being cut? So that's where we're in the work that we've been doing at Stanford with the Center for Ocean Solutions and Bappenas and so forth, are thinking about how can we enable these communities to market locally to get better prices. And to us, a possible solution is the free meals program. And I have to say that one of the things that we have welcomed in the current meals program of the Prabowo administration is that it's not just school, it's preschool. Preschool is extremely important because stunting happens in the first 1,000 days of life. That is a critical period. In other words, before children go to school. Of course, nutrition after they reach school age is extremely important as well, in cognitive development and physical development and so forth. So what was missing in the previous administration's school meals program was blue food. There was almost no fish or other aquatic products. So how do we create an opportunity for the food to be sourced locally for the school meals program to connect those community producers? And this is also connected on the agriculture side, not just on fish and so forth. So this is where I think, thinking of multiple solutions, some technological innovation, particularly, for example, on seaweed science, which I know that Ipe Bay and Bogor have been working on, and we've been talking to them about that because seaweed has enormous potential for some species for its nutritional content. And there it's a matter of seeing if we can work with local communities to produce nutrition-rich seaweed and innovations that are being used to even enhance the nutritional content by seaweed scientists, rather than producing seaweed that goes through 6 steps and winds up in China for carrageenan, and so forth. So, I mean, those are just examples, but I think this is the way that we need to think. But that will, going back to your previous question, that will require both listening to and providing some education for these communities, and also the cooperation of local governments and up through the government chain. So I think that's the challenge, and we want to work on that.
Thank you. We've come to the point where we open it up to the audience to ask questions. And I'm told that we have time for 3 to 4 more questions. Please. I will allow for the questions to be asked in accordance to the protocol. Oh, we have Pak Ibas. Yeah.
Halo.
Ah. He's the younger one.
Thank you. I'm not a scientist and I'm not a professor. I'm not in the process to be one. Pardon me with my jacket. This temperature is like in the Greenland. We're very cold here. I'm sure I'm wearing batik underneath my jacket, but it's in a different color. I really enjoy all the important, and of course, I couldn't agree more. My name is Ebe Ibas, also a member of parliament. Thank you all the panelists for the humble discussions and brief insight. Dr. Ahaya said, there are challenges and opportunities of green growth, sustainability, growth with equity. And Dr. Arun said that the mission's impact to serve life on Earth. And we know that the President SBA, or President, championed for the 4-track strategies on the pro-growth with equity, pro-jobs, pro-poor, and pro-environment, which aligns with Bill Gates that recently visiting Indonesia and had his dialogue with President Prabowo that both reaffirmed a shared commitment to sustainable future. This lecture also supports strategic cross-sector synergy to foster green growth. That is a people-centered, science-based, and forward-looking. Questions, honorable panelists, Prof. David Cohen, Prof. Yu Chui, Prof. William Chue, about the green growth and inclusions. Dr. Cohen said and mentioned about so many things about blue food. Indonesia, as we know all, is a developing country. How can country that ensures that green growth strategies truly benefit all layers of the society, especially the marginalized communities with limited access to the digital infrastructures and clean energy? What do you think? What the policies and innovations are most effective in bridging this gap while
Kenapa sih harus ikut program wakaf Quran untuk santri? Ini adalah Al-Quran khusus hafalan hasil wakaf dari para donatur.
maintaining environmental sustainability and economic viability? I know some of the answers have been discussed and we heard so many things. I cannot agree more on that. Second, about the multi-sector collaboration. Indonesia have so many minerals, like Pak Gita said, nickel and all that. But we know hydrogen energy is coming in this world. In achieving a just and sustainable energy transitions, what specific roles should be prioritized by the governments, the locals, the academic institutions, and the private sectors? How can cross-sector collaborations be structured to ensure long-term impact, cost effectiveness, and local relevance in developing countries like in Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. I'll open it up to do we take the questions first? Okay. There's one lady in the back.
Thank you. Good morning, distinguished panelists, Pak Gita. My name is Dewi Susila Stuti, and I'm a lecturer at the Master and Doctoral Programs in Leadership and Policy Innovation, School of Graduate Studies at Gadjah Mada University. I've heard that the panelists talked about the relationship between policymaking, science and policymaking, and also Prof. Majumdar talked about the importance of the Silicon Valley. I'm curious to find out where the position of equity is between sustainable growth within the context of the title of the conference, which is sustainable growth with equity. So in that sense, my question is almost similar to the question of Pa Ibas. So from my experience as a researcher, I found out that there is a disconnect between science and policy making, and that there is a difference between discourse and praxis. For example, there are a lot of research that show that women are marginalized in the coastal communities, in the mining communities, oil palm industries. So I would like to know where is the position of equity within this sentence, sustainable growth with equity. Of course, intuitively, we know where the position of equity is, but I wonder when will the equity be? What is the form of equity, particularly when it comes to gender and indigenous community? Because I think what we see is that there's a lot of generic policy one size fits all that I think tend to marginalize women and indigenous community even further. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll allow for, yeah, that was a good question. Both of them. Please.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Who's given the mic, Pak Gita?
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Emil Dardak, and I'm now the Vice Governor of East Java Province. It's the second largest province in Indonesia in terms of population, with more than 40 million people. Very briefly, during the leadership of President Yudhoyono, I was working with the World Bank to develop a way to catalyze the adoption of geothermal technology. And we introduced back then what we call as a feed-in tariff. We are fortunate that under President Yudhoyono's leadership, we managed to introduce the feed-in tariff, because without that, it is impossible to compete with coal as the least cost technology. And the National Electricity Utility, or PLN, was subsidized by the government at that time. So the focus was on how to minimize the subsidy. But under President Yudhoyono's leadership, we managed to introduce feed-in tariff and started many developments of geothermal fields which would not have otherwise been available. Now, fast forward, however, I think at that time also in COP13 with the Kyoto Protocol, we signed an MOU to basically utilize the carbon trading mechanism to actually bring forward future cash flows and generate some funding, which the World Bank will underwrite. But now we also have the Paris Agreement, which the United States have pulled out, I understand, and creates a lot of question. Before COVID, we were at the heights of this awareness of carbon. A lot of companies have put forward their sustainability report, and even companies that were operating in China were very apprehensive about the turning off of the hydro due to the water in the Mekong River and shifting to fossil fuel. But now it seems like in Indonesia, at least in my province, it seems like it's going back into the idea that adoption of renewable energy is all about the economics. We have PV, photovoltaic, which is now very popular, and it's mainly because of the economics, because it can compete with the conventional power from the grid. We have worked on a PPP, public-private partnership, in a municipality called Madiun, where the street lightings have been retrofitted with PV, and the private developer is compensated by the saving. So imagine our shift into renewable is actually because of the saving in the electricity cost. So it's not because of the conscience that we need to actually reduce our carbon footprint. And even one of our state-owned enterprise managed by the provincial government was working with a company from the UK, where they will also retrofit some of the major buildings. But we weren't able to proceed because the state electricity was concerned of losing their customers. So they were giving a maximum that if you exceed 30% of the grid capacity and you substitute it with another power such as PV, we will not we will not supply you with power. Now, since we cannot be fully self-sufficient with PV, so we would still need the power. So we decided not to push forward with that. So that's an example. And finally, another way of seeing renewable energy working is in the field of solid waste. Minister Yudhoyono recently visited, coordinating Mr. Yudhoyono visited one of the facility in Surabaya, which is converting solid waste from the final dumping site into electricity. We know that it is not enough to even compensate the cost of the waste management, but the power produced by this incinerator is very useful to at least reduce the cost. But then it gives an example that, so if you don't couple this with another issue, if it's purely just about getting greener power, it's still a big challenge in our developing country, especially with this fiscal austerity measures that is being propagated everywhere. I think it started with the US with the Doge, and then Indonesia is trying to follow suit, and local government. Anything that sounds green, it may not be a populist movement right now. So I'm just kindly sharing and wanting to hear your thoughts. And just a final quick question, especially to with the aspect of the value chain. Given that you mentioned, we are very hopeful with the sodium ion battery because it opens up the utilization of nickel. But how is the current spread of technology ownership, patent, as well as the valuable materials in the global value chain is going to add up, given that the tariff and the trade war is going to make countries becoming very conservative when it comes to relying on a single global supply chain. And they are shifting more towards becoming self-sufficient and creating this backup system. I mean, how does this technology ownership spread? Just a very out of curiosity. Thank you very much.
Well crafted question. Yeah. Okay, we've got one more.
Yeah, hello. I'm Tati Sahia from the expert group of Democratic Party. Thank you for the distinguished panelists. So I would like to conclude that during the presidential Yudhoyono leading at that time, Indonesia sort of like achieving a very good productions related with the energy within petroleum or including as well as the gas and electricity, or I will say fuel productions. At this moment, we sort of like becoming the number one productions in the nickel within the mineral productions. But Professor Williams sort of like mentioning, in related with the productions of the energy, it's sort of like giving so many resources and a very complex process to produce sort of like a small amount of energy. So that's what we currently facing in Indonesia. So I was sort of like wondering, because of with the current situations of Indonesia that facing, we sort of like having difficulty to sort of like produce our petroleum product in order that to produce a very good and solid, reliable energy, while we sort of like not yet in the renewable energy positions. At the same facing. But I'm Tati Sahia from the expert group of Democratic Party. Thank you for the distinguished panelists. So I would like to conclude that during the presidential Yudhoyono leading at that time, Indonesia sort of like achieving a very good productions related with the energy within petroleum or including as well as the gas and electricity, or I will say fuel productions. At this moment, we sort of like becoming the number one productions in the nickel within the mineral productions. But Professor Williams sort of like mentioning, in related with the productions of the energy, it's sort of like giving so many resources and a very complex process to produce sort of like a small amount of energy. So that's what we currently facing in Indonesia. So I was sort of like wondering, because of with the current situations of Indonesia that facing, we sort of like having difficulty to sort of like produce our petroleum product in order that to produce a very good and solid, reliable energy, while we sort of like not yet in the renewable energy positions. At the same time, we also producing a very high amount of nickel in order that to produce the electric battery, but we sort of like limited to use this battery for all the people of Indonesia, yeah. But we have sort of like facing the risk of the environmental damage because of the nickel productions. So I was wondering whether you have sort of like a quick win solutions with all the very complex process to produce this sustainable growth, particularly for energy that could be affordable and for all the people in Indonesia, that I think we sort of like facing a very high cost of electricity as well as fuel, like for the energy like cars or everything like that. So that's going to be my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll cap it at this. We've gotten 5 fantastic questions from 4 people. I will allow for the panelists to take a crack at it before I make some remarks. Yeah. For you to answer. Yi, you want to start first?
Maybe I'll try to answer a few. So let my fellow panelists to answer the rest. Let me start from the first one. First of all, you have a great sense of humor. I really like it, just like your brother. So you are very similar, have a great sense of humor, asking questions. About the economic growth, actually related to the second question is equity. By definition, impact to scale, you need to impact a lot of people. You need to keep equity in mind in order to have that impact, to impact really a lot of people. This also means this needs to couple together with economic growth or the sustainability, no matter what's the technology. I like to describe this to eventually get to the equity and the green growth. We need cheaper, better, and faster solution to utilizing. I think one of our advisory council member, Arun, is Tom Steyer. He often mentioned this, to my ear. Eventually, you need cheaper, better, and faster. If you are not cheap enough, it's very hard to reach broad range of people to have equity right there. Let me also answer this question about, talking about nickel again, coming back. I'll let Will address the clean electricity to produce nickel issue. You mentioned hydrogen, right? Potential hydrogen coming, economy. Yeah, I think this is a multi-solutions problem right here. The energy space is so big. The battery is already taking off. Even hydrogen economy come, the battery industry will be still there to satisfy many applications. And also, let me also mention to you for hydrogen economy, if it's hydrogen electrolyzer, turn out to be that electrolyzer, the alkaline base use a lot of nickel as well to generate hydrogen. Let me see. Maybe I'll just answer one more. And then I'll let my fellow panelists to answer the rest. I think for the third question about the photovoltaic story, PV electricity, you install a lot. The reason is the cost is now low enough. So to be competitive, you look at many renewable technology, PV, wind. In the early days, this government subsidy somewhere, right? PV is the story when European countries subsidize that. China increased the production, keep getting the cost low and low. Eventually, it becomes cost competitive. You look at LED, light emitting diode, it is a similar story. It got subsidized first, and then the whole production of this 3-5 semiconductor gets a lower cost. LED's cost is very competitive right now. Similar story for lithium-ion batteries. There's also subsidies, early days from China governments to build up the whole supply chain. Eventually becomes so competitive for the electrical cars. So it might be repeating its own story in other technology sector as well. Geothermal, we might need to do that as well. So I just want to share my perspective with you. Maybe I should pause right here and see my fellow panelists can answer other questions.
All right. Will?
There was remarkable similarities in the 4 questions posed. And let me add on to some of Yi's thoughts. The first comment I want to make is on the value to cost ratio. I think much of the discussion today in the questions focuses on the denominator, the cost. Absolutely, we need to increase the affordability. However, there are also opportunities to recognizing value and also increasing the value. For instance, when it comes to the valuation of security, national security, the valuation of the environmental benefits. These are extraordinarily difficult things to value, but as a global community, if we can find out how to properly value this, this can provide the driving force to decrease and ride the learning curves, especially in those initial stages. So that is my first comment. The second comment is on equity. I am a huge believer that an equitable transition will drive the fastest public acceptance. And let me just take a moment to humbly reflect on the United States' own transition. It has been met with a number of challenges on the equity. Our own research at Stanford has shown the energy transition in the United States has not been an equitable one, especially when it comes to siting of large-scale projects, such as wind. I think we must carefully think about analyzing strategically how to increase the equity as so to drive public acceptance. Without the public acceptance, it will be difficult to further accelerate the transition. The final comment I want to make is to echo what Yi said. Looking back in history, there has been a number of these global exercises for developed nations to bear some of the cost of technology learning. He mentioned solar and batteries. I'll just add a few more details on the battery example, given my own familiarity. Lithium-ion battery was first developed by Sony commercially for camcorders. And that was at close to $10,000 per kilowatt hour. That provided that initial small market for driving down the cost. Then came laptop computers that was about $5,000 per kilowatt hour at a somewhat larger market size. Then came consumer electronics, premium electric vehicles, and now we're seeing mass market electric vehicles. Again, decreasing cost, greater market. And now we're looking at utility scale storage, which is now providing a more less intermittent renewable electricity. And that cost today is now coming in at less than $100 per kilowatt hour, from 10,000 to 100. That's a 100x. And these small but high margin premium markets provided, and that has been largely being supplied by developed nations. So I think there is opportunity for global partnerships on how to finance these learning curves. I think ultimately we will get there. The question, as Gita, you pointed out, as by the audience, is how fast? And can we speed this up? So I think that represents a huge opportunity in this global exercise for providing and financing the learnings.
Thank you. Dave?
I'll be brief in addressing, I think, some aspects of the equity question. One was about sort of gender and coastal communities. That's is indeed a problem. It's not one that requires a lot of innovation in one way.
Kalau sebelum minum hoto sering perih, mual, sakit di ulu hati. Kalau sekarang udah nggak.
Because under Indonesian law, in order to have your profession as a fisher on your ID card, you have to actually be physically involved in catching the fish. You have to be on the boat and catch the fish. That means that women are excluded. So and even though in small scale fishing, it's a family business because it has many aspects and women are involved in most of them, but maybe not out on the boat at sea catching the fish. On their ID card, they are housewives. And that means they are excluded from various public services that they would otherwise be entitled to. That's not an innovation problem, that's a policy problem. On the other hand, and this is something we've been working on with another Wiryuan, that's Yasmin Wiryuan, who is also a visiting scholar at Stanford now, and that's on promoting digital literacy for women in marginalized communities and coastal communities and so forth. Education is a really important component of equity, access to education, and that's something also that there's a lot of work going on at the School of Education at Stanford that we want to connect to along with our collaborator. Finally, one of the challenges that producers of blue food face is in understanding pricing in their markets. So one of my students has been studying over the last year, how do Indonesian seaweed farmers identify prices and where are the best prices? They use Facebook. So she's been using sort of large language, whatever extraction to understand this. There should be a better way, and I know that in India there's been a lot of work on connecting producers to markets and pricing and so forth. And I think this is an area where innovation is also important for equity.
There's no debate about whether or not there's technological solution to the world's problems. But there's a lot more debate about whether or not there's economic wherewithal. And I want to put this more